Next, we have Dr. Kate Brady, who's an ex-speaker who will be speaking to us from Victoria again. Dr. Kate Brady is a renowned expert in community recovery from disasters. Dr. Brady is currently the National Disaster Recovery Advisor at the Australian Red Cross and Research Fellow Community Resilience with the University of Melbourne. Dr. Brady's LinkedIn profile, she describes herself as a disaster recovery nerd who gets excited about practical projects that work well. So her presentation today is going to be named Long-Term Disaster Recovery, where she will share her lessons learned through the 10-year Beyond Bushfires report on the Black Saturday bushfires, produced by the University of Western Australia. Are you there, Kate? You are.
Hi, how are you?
Welcome to Bunbury.
I wish I was in Bunbury. It's been a long time since I've been able to visit. I would love to be there today.
Well, please.
Thanks so much for having me. As we know, I'm not with you today. I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne, Victoria, so near the Bay Area. And I'm really disappointed that I haven't been able to be there today to hear what you're all up to and see all the different chats. I've got to see part of Lewis's chat just now, but not the other speakers, unfortunately. We're going to have a chat today about long-term disaster recovery, and I'm going to draw a lot of the stuff that I'm presenting today from the Beyond Bushfires study, which happened through the University of Melbourne and a range of other organisations. We'll get to that in just a second. But I just want to acknowledge I wear two hats, and you can sort of only have one PowerPoint template slide. So I've just chosen the University of Melbourne one today. But my reflections here, I suppose, are both from a practical application as a practitioner and as a researcher. Now, I know I've had an opportunity to meet with a lot of you. I've come over to WA a lot over the last sort of decade or so. And I know that you know disasters have long-term impacts. And I think particularly over the last probably 15 years or so, particularly since Hurricane Katrina, we learned a lot out of September 11, a lot out of Hurricane Katrina, and we just seem to be having these really big watershed events back to back almost, aren't we? Like we're not getting a lot of breathing time in between them. But I think it means as a result, a lot of our thinking when it comes to the long-term impacts has come a long way. So I know you know disasters have long-term impacts, and I'm going to talk to you a bit about some of the findings that are coming out at the moment and where I think it's evolving to, where I'm putting my money on for the next decade or so. So as I mentioned, Beyond Bushfires is a longitudinal study that's been running. It's been hosted out of the University of Melbourne, but a range of different universities and different organisations are involved. It's quite a big project team. And it's a longitudinal research project looking at the 2009 Victorian Black Saturday fires. And there's been 3 different data collection points. And so it's a really interesting study to be able to look at some of those long-term impacts and how they change over the time. I'm not going to go into the methods or anything today, but if you go online and find this report, if you just type in Beyond Bushfires 10 years, I really encourage you to have a look at it. It's not an academic-y type report, I promise. It's most of it's quite beautiful infographics, and it makes it really easy to digest a lot of information very quickly. And then if you're interested in learning more, there's a lot of publications that have come out of it, scientific publications, and you can read more about the methods and things like that. It's, as I say, a really big project team. There's more people that are on the screen now, but it was headed up by Lisa Gibbs. So it's not my own data. Some of my research has contributed to this, and I've got other research I'm drawing on, but all of this information is available to you as well. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how long does a recovery take? Because, you know, we don't really know, do we? It's a thing. We say it's long. We say it's longer than we used to say it was. I remember when I first started working in disaster recovery, I had quite a few conversations. I wouldn't even say they were conversations, people pointing their finger at me and saying, look, if you need to be there for more than 10 weeks afterwards, you're doing something wrong, girly. And I think that thinking has probably changed and evolved a bit, or at least those people aren't as loud anymore. I'm very grateful to say. And so how long do we think it takes, though? We don't really know. So at the last intake, at the 10-year point following the 2009 Victorian bushfires, as part of the Beyond Bushfire questionnaire, they asked, how long do you think recovery takes? So are you feeling recovered? and asked from both an individual perspective and a community perspective, because we know a lot of disaster recovery is that interplay between the individual and their environment and the broader society. And what was, I think, quite interesting, so we have 3 different types of communities, so a number of communities grouped within these 3 bands. So low impact communities being the control here, medium impact communities where there were some impacts from the fires, some direct impacts, but lots of intangible or indirect impacts, and then the high impacts where there was lots of tangible and intangible impacts. So if we look at the 10-year mark for those high impacted communities, just over 60% of the sample group were saying that they felt personally mostly recovered or fully recovered. But when you ask them about how did they think the rest of their community was doing, it was a really low number, so much higher in those low and medium impacts. So we can start to see being able to draw around some of those controls from those different groups, that those different impacts might be having different effects that take longer to recover from. And so if we start unpicking that into some of the different types of impacts, the first one that I'll put up is around mental health. Now, as we know, mental health impacts, so this is not from the 2009 study, this is a table that came from the World Health Organization guide based on Mark van Umeren's work and other people in 2006, so it's an old one now. But there has been a lot of research that's gone into the mental health impacts of disasters, and fairly consistently globally, it says pretty similar things. Like it varies a little bit, but it says fairly consistent things across the board. The thing is that almost all of the data that is used to report on mental health impacts after disasters, the vast majority of it, it's data points that are captured within the first 12 months to 18 months after a disaster. And so that's one of the things that this Beyond Bushfires study offers us. It's a longer term view of how people are faring from a mental health perspective. So again, looking at those low, medium and high cohorts, Richard Bryant is the researcher from the University of New South Wales who's really led on a lot of the mental health impact stuff. If we look at the 10-year mark, and there's different publications that really go into the detail of this, but if we look at this 10-year mark, we can see here that in high impacted communities, around 22% of participants are reporting probable disorders, probable mental health diagnoses based on the questionnaires and how they responded to them. But I think even more interesting than that, some of the work that Richard and Colin Gallagher and a number of other researchers were able to show is it's not the same cohort of people over the whole time. So it's not the same 20-something% of people that have consistently been presenting with mental illnesses. At the 5-year mark, there were some changes in the types of people who were presenting. So it's not a consistent thing. It's a dynamic change that goes over time and it has really long-term impacts. Then if we add to that, so that's probable rates of disorder. So a disorder is a diagnosable mental health condition that meets a certain set of criteria. You know, there's quite clear criteria for diagnoses. But then one of the things I find quite interesting is the group of people who were, the clinicians refer to them as SubSymdromal. So people who are showing some or lots of symptoms of mental illness or mental distress, but they're not meeting that clinical threshold for being diagnosed with a mental illness. It's people who we would generally refer to, I suppose, as having a degraded quality of life. So they may not be diagnosed with a mental illness, but they're certainly not having an enjoyable time of it. They're really still struggling still, and it's impacting their day-to-day life and their capacity to do things. And in that cohort of people in those high impacted communities, they're looking around nearly 20% of people. So if you combine that with the people who are still experiencing symptoms of probable disorder, plus these subsyndromal groups, it's a really big cohort of people who are still struggling at some point mentally. It doesn't mean it's every day an issue for them, but it does mean that it's having an impact on their quality of life in the longer term. One of the things that we know a lot more now as well, out of both, lots of different disaster events. So Hurricane Katrina, the triple disaster in Japan, and various other different events is around social capital. And the Beyond Bushfires study was able to contribute to this too. But there's lots of international data now showing social capital being so important. So those social connections that we have, there's different types of social capital, and the way the social capitals connect is all different. And there's lots and lots of different research on that you can dig into now if that's something you're interested in. But one of the things that the main findings that people like Daniel Aldridge, the picture on the screen there, are showing are things like social networks matter more than bottled water and batteries when it comes to survival. So it's around knowing the people around you is going to be the thing that is more important to your survival than some of those items we more traditionally talk about. And that those connected communities, social capital being the biggest indicator of how well those communities recover, rather than it being about money, the amount of money coming in or the amount of money that existed before. There's some really interesting work done, again, as part of the Beyond Bushfire study, but it tapped into some of the research that's been happening internationally around staying and moving and possibly rebuilding if you've lost your home. We haven't known a lot about this previously. We've known that some people make some decisions that we don't really understand. We usually only capture like sort of quite aggregated data to say, you know, at what point did how many people move back into a different community or stay, or over time, what did the high level aggregates look like? But we don't know a lot about the process and decision-making process that people go through to make those calls, you know, whether or not they've lost their home. And so one of the things that Beyond Bushfires team was able to do was to have a look at people who had both stayed and also people who had chosen to rebuild, and that's the Hammer group, and people who had chosen to move away from the disaster-affected communities. And what they showed was that in the longer term sense, the outcomes for wellbeing were pretty similar. And some of the challenges, both groups had challenges, but for different reasons. So the positive side of staying and rebuilding was that these people really demonstrated they had a very strong attachment to people and to the place. So the people around them and the place that they were at, and a really shared sense of experience, and that had supported their recovery very well. But on the negative side of things, there had been loads and loads and loads of disruptions that they'd had to deal with, loads of secondary stresses that they'd had to deal with over the years. And that was really wearing them down from a fatigue perspective and a wellbeing perspective. And for the group of people who moved, there was less disruptions because they were moving to communities that hadn't been impacted by disasters. So less of those post-disaster stresses. You can send your kids to a school because the school hasn't burned down. You can go and get groceries because there's still a grocery store there, or petrol, or, you know, and there's not the constant sounds of rebuilding around you and things. But for those people, that disaster experience was still very present a long time afterwards. So talking to them, it was still something that was really playing on their minds. And there were probably two reasons for that. One, if you moved away, you were probably more likely to have had a really quite profound impact in the fires themselves. But the second was that you didn't have that day-to-day interaction with people who got it, you know, people who also understood and were going through it. And most of the services were targeted locally, so you didn't have the same sort of access to that. And then staying on that rebuilding thing, so for the people who decided to rebuild, you all know, you will have all seen these in the news, you know, the 12-month point after a disaster, the 1-year anniversary, there will be outrage in some quarters, and there will be a newspaper headline somewhere or a TV special somewhere about how few people have rebuilt at 12 months. And we know most people haven't rebuilt at 12 months. We know it takes a long time to make the decision, and even longer to then actually go about doing it. In normal times, it takes us a long time to build a house sometimes. And so one of the things they were able to ask at the 10-year mark was, well, when did you rebuild, if you rebuilt? And you can see on there at the time points that different people rebuilt. But what was most interesting is most people thought it was about right. Some people thought that they had rebuilt too soon. Some people thought they had rebuilt too late. That was a very small group. But most people thought it had been about right for them. And I think that's something we really should take heart in, that for a lot of people that made the decision to rebuild, maybe not for a year or 2 years or 3 years or even longer, it was because it was the right decision for their family. And in the end, it worked out pretty well. And I know that Rob Gordon has come over a lot to Western Australia to talk to you after different events. But that's one of the things he talks about. You know, if you think about this from a long-term perspective, you know, 10, 20, 30 years down the track from a disaster, it's not really going to matter whether you rebuilt your house a year after a disaster or 3 years after a disaster, but it really will matter if you got divorced in the process, or it really will matter if your family dissolved or you lost your friends because you were so busy focusing on rebuilding efforts. So it's something that I think we need to take heart in and take a more complex view of when we're planning for it. When it came to experiences of violence, this wasn't specifically around intimate partner violence. It was around experiences of violence generally. Women in low-impacted communities, about 1% of women reported an increase in violence, but in high-impacted communities, it was sevenfold. And there was a connection between women who experienced experience violence in the long term after a disaster, and households where there had been a severe financial stress, so an income reduction or other financial stresses. And this, I think, contributes to a much broader body of work that we have seen emerge out of the last decade, knowing and sort of trying to pinpoint the very difficult topic of experiences of violence, particularly women experiencing violence after disasters, and looking at why that happens, where that happens, how it can be prevented, the sorts of interventions that work. And it's we know it's a difficult area to research at the best of times when all services are functional, let alone when there's a disaster. So this is a piece of work that contributes to that. And I'm really happy to say that that is a growing field of inquiry. We know more about that now than we ever have, but we still have a lot of work to do. I've got, I think, two more things I just want to talk about in terms of impacts that were identified, and that was around connection to the environment. So I think more and more we're understanding what social connections mean for us. People who have strong social connections before a disaster, we know, tend to fare better after a disaster, but we haven't known so much about connections to environment. And one of the things that came out, a really great piece of work by Karen Block and some others, talking about people who had a really strong connection to the natural environment, who experienced really considerable grief for the environment, and that grief, not just for their own experience, but for the experience of the natural environment they could see, and being quite heartbroken and bereft of the loss that came with those impacts to the natural environment. But interestingly, in the longer term, even though those people were more likely to feel grief and sorrow and devastation as a result of the impacts to the environment, those connections were associated with reduced psychological signs of distress and fewer symptoms of mental illnesses and other conditions. And it was really aligned with a higher level of resilience and post-traumatic growth, life satisfaction, particularly as people connected their own recovery experiences to the experience of the natural environment, sort of regenerating and recovering. And the last one that I wanted to point out was just around the impacts to education. So the international literature around impacts to education and educational attainment around the board, they've been really mixed. The results have been really mixed, and a lot of that is because the research has been really mixed. There's not really been a consistent way of looking at how children and young people are affected by disasters from an educational attainment. In some findings, they find that in some cases, actually, children go better, and often that's attributed to smaller disasters where huge amounts of support are offered to the children. So there's this real wraparound support offered to children and young people around education. And in some cases, there has been neutral findings, but in this one, so looking at NAPLAN results for students in year 3 and year 5 around the 2 to 4 year mark after the Black Saturday bushfires, there was a reduction in what you would expect kids in that cohort to have developed to, particularly around reading and literacy, that there was a drop. And so we're seeing a longer tailed lag, I suppose, and sort of a drag on if you're at a point where you're falling behind for a couple of years and the next couple of years are harder again to sort of catch up on. And so we need to be thinking about that when we're thinking about those long-term recovery supports. What sort of supports do children and young people need, and teachers and school communities need, to be able to bolster them up? You know, if they're going to be experiencing this stress, what can we do to put in place around them to make sure they don't experience those losses and can keep going? So one of the things I was asked to think about was, well, what now? What comes now? What are the next areas, the next frontiers for this? And I'm not really a gambling person, but if I was, here is where I would be putting my money on, things that we're going to need to know more about over the next decade. The first one is around concurrent and compounding events. We're just not getting a breather, are we? And we know this as emergency services. We're not really getting a breather in between events. But communities are just being hammered, a lot of them over and over and over and over and over again. And so, you know, for example, if we look at the COVID overlay in lots of parts of the country, you know, it's having a really devastating impact on communities that were experiencing droughts, then bushfires, then floods, then COVID, all within a really short period of time. And I think one of the things, so we probably can't do much about how much hazard there is. We might be able to do a bit about that, not so much in our control. We might be able to support how people experience trauma from these events. But one of the things that is definitely within our control as an emergency management sector that I don't think we have figured out how to tackle yet is how we treat concurrent and compounding events. Because at the moment, operationally, we just start again, don't we? We start again. The funding is based on us starting again. So an event happens, well, that's that event. We park it to that side, and it's that funding stream and that budget allocation and that negotiation and this, that and the other. And then another event comes and we start again, instead of saying, okay, what's already going on there? And so if you're at a local government, you know that you need to keep dealing with this community that's already stressed, and then there's other stresses on top. But from an operational perspective, we're still seeing them as being separate events, and funding is still being treated as a separate event. One of the things that I'm particularly interested, I think over the last decade and a bit, we've become quite good at being able to apply a demographic lens to who's vulnerable and who's resilient, and who's simultaneously vulnerable and who's simultaneously resilient. But I think the thing that's really stuck with me over recent years is I still don't always know vulnerable to what or resilient to what. I mean, I know we say they're vulnerable to disasters, they're vulnerable to emergencies, we're resilient, they're resilient, to what? Like, to what specifically? To what really narrowly specifically? So if we think about disasters having hundreds of impacts, thousands of impacts, who is specifically vulnerable to impact A? Who is specifically vulnerable to impact B? Who is specifically vulnerable to impact C? Is there an overlap in any of those? And what does that mean for our interventions? And the reason that I think that we need to think about that instead of just thinking generally vulnerable to disasters is because then we can't target what we're trying to do about it. We can't target those interventions to try and help prevent those impacts in the first place, but also to help people recover from those specific impacts. If we just treat it with a blanket brush, I think it becomes very hard for us to really do anything with nuance or with careful consideration. We don't know a lot about the impacts on recovery workers. We're getting better and better and better at understanding what the impacts are on our frontline first responders, and I think that's amazing. We still don't know much at all about the impacts on recovery workers, and part of that is because there's not really a recovery workforce. The recovery workforce comes from all different places, all different industries, all different sectors, all different organisations, and they sort of get thrown into something for a reasonably short period of time and then sort of chucked out of it. We don't know much about what happens to that group. I've started doing a little bit of work on that. And one of the things that I found quite interesting in a very, very small sample that I looked at, a subsample of a bigger study that I was looking at, was that a number of the recovery workers that I was looking at, they just left their community at one point. They worked really, really, really hard. They worked their guts out in their communities that they were working in to serve. They worked as hard as they could for years, and then they left. They decided, and each of them viewed it as being an individual thing. Oh, well, my partner had an opportunity to work overseas, so we took it. Oh, I decided to move to another city to be closer to my mum, so I took it. But it was an uncannily consistent thing. And then I started looking at some other qualitative literature that's happened in different places, for example, the UK, looking at the Hull floods, and started seeing stories popping up there. Now, I can't quantify that. I can't verify it because I haven't done the work on it, but we don't know a lot about what happens to recovery workers. We know little bits from September 11, little bits from Hurricane Katrina, but we don't know much about this, but we're increasingly asking this workforce to step up. And I think one of the real challenges and really interesting things that we are going to see is in the coming years is this tension around community-led recovery at a time where there is more and more government and governance and other agencies being involved. I think in some ways it's really great that more and more bodies think it's part of their job to be involved in disaster recovery. I really welcome that. But we're talking about something that needs to be community-led for it to be effective, disaster recovery, at the same time where we've got new agencies. For example, the new national agency, we have new state agencies in some states. We have lots of different organisations who are new to playing in the recovery space, which again, welcome, and I think it's great. But I think that will be a really interesting tension. The more and more professionalised and the bigger the governance around disaster recovery becomes, what happens to that community-led approach and how difficult does it get? I also, just before I wrap up, have a shameless plug. The first is I I've just been involved in a project with the ABC where we've put together a podcast called After the Disaster, and it's all about disaster recovery. So I'd really welcome you to download that. I promised them that I would plug it at everything I spoke at over the next couple of months. And the second is on that disaster recovery research, some colleagues and I are looking to set some stuff up around that at the moment. So if you work in disaster recovery or you're interested in disaster recovery, shoot me a line because I'd love to hear from you, and we'll try and connect you in if you're interested. I'll provide you more information anyway. So that's me. And my understanding is that we are going to have some time for questions if there's any questions.
Hey, Doctor. Any questions to the Doctor? Come on, you know you want to. Got one. Can you step to a microphone, please, sir?
I used to think it was awkward standing at a lectern waiting for this to happen, but I guarantee you it's more awkward being on the other side of the country in a room.
So I work in mostly biosecurity responses. In some of those responses, there are winners and there are losers within a community. So some people may be affected, some may be not affected, some may be positively affected because their competition is. How does that affect recovery where the community is not evenly affected and there are winners and losers? I'm not sure if that makes sense.
No, it absolutely makes sense. And I think that happens in almost every disaster, that there are some people who on one metric win and other people on another metric that on the same metric that lose, and vice versa. I think the thing that's really important to think about is the high level of complexity of impact. So, for example, if we're thinking financially or from a business perspective, there are some industries that really do win out of disasters, that it is a windfall for them. And that's why I think if we look at, the macroeconomic data around disasters, it actually doesn't tell a very interesting story. Disasters cost huge amounts of money, but they also generate a lot of money for some industries. So the macroeconomic data, it's sort of, I always think it's a little bit weird. And the work that I would really encourage you to look at on the more microeconomic data around disasters, I'm going to say his name wrong because I don't have it in front of me, but it's Mehmet Yusul Blogsu, I think is his surname. I'm really sorry if Mehmet is listening to this and I've just mispronounced your surname, but he's at Deakin University and he did some work through the Bushfire Natural Hazards CRC looking at the micro and macroeconomic impacts of disasters. And there's also another researcher called Ilan Noy who talks about it as well. So I think the thing to remember if you are trying to plan for disaster recovery is not trying to just use one metric or one facet of the disaster impact to think about how people are affected. The communities, in my experience, that recover the best are the communities where community leaders are able to say early on, we have all been affected. So it doesn't matter whether you lost your house or didn't lose your house. It doesn't matter whether your business is going to be booming while someone else lost their business. Disaster impacts are so multifaceted that we've all been impacted in some ways, and we're all going to have to be able to help each other in some way. And being able to drill down into what that means in different communities is quite important. I know I was plugging the podcast. Sorry, I have another participant in the conference with me at the moment. It's Melbourne, we're homeschooling. I know I was plugging.
Look behind you.
And that was, I know it's like a pantomime, isn't it? He's behind you, she's behind you. There's an episode that is actually going to be coming out about this. I know I was just being silly before giving it a plug, but the episode is called Disasters Impact More People Than You Think. And there's this woman called Vicky Richards who's from Edgecombe in New Zealand. And she talks about a flood, a really big flood that went through their community, and how their community just decided really early on, we're just going to say everyone's been affected by this and just not quibble about it, and not try and sort of create a hierarchy out of this, and we'll try and help each other where we can help each other. So for those people who are winning, maybe it is that they get to employ other people who have lost their jobs or whatever it is. there will be some people who cope very well mentally with it and other people who don't cope very well mentally. There will be some people who lose their relationships out of the stress that comes from a disaster and other people who don't. There will be some people who will adapt very well and will move into something new. There will be some people who get left behind. There will be some people who have existential distress around, well, what does this mean for my sense of place in the world, my sense of safety in the world? And so there are all these different impacts that happen. And the more we can say, well, we're in it together and we're going to try not to compete around these different impacts. And I think in some ways, longer term, COVID, particularly with the lockdowns, will be a really interesting case study around this. There are some industries who cannot find workers to fulfill all the work that they have to do fast enough, that their sector is overwhelmed by how much work they have on at the moment. And there are other places who have been absolutely crippled by it. So I think there are lots of different case studies we can look at it, but in my experience, the places that recover best are the places who acknowledge how complex disaster impacts are.
Thank you.
We've still got a participant. You want to?
Somebody's hungry.
All these people can see you. Would you like to talk to them? No? Would you like to come back in 5 minutes? Okay. You're just going to have to wait for your question for a second. Does anyone else have a question? Because if while you're going to the microphone, I've got a question here.
We have an online question, if I may. The question is, was there anything in the Black Saturday research findings that particularly surprised you? And it goes on to say, or went to in unusual direction. Yes, or went in an unusual direction.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the rebuilding one, the satisfaction people had around rebuilding surprised me. And I think part of that comes because I did a lot of work in those communities for about nearly 3 years after the fires happened, 2.5 years. And just looking at how difficult the decisions were for a lot of people about whether or not to stay, whether to relocate within families being undecided. So, one person in a family wanting to stay and others in the family wanting to leave. When it came to rebuilding, just how overwhelmingly stressful the rebuilding process was for people. So I think actually more than anything, I was just really happy to see that most people felt like they had made a decision that worked for them, because I had seen the messy front end of it, if that makes sense. I think there's more work to do in that space to understand how people make those decisions and what decisions they make. What are the trigger points for decisions? How can we ease some of those just horrendous secondary stresses that come for people who have to make those decisions after? And those secondary stresses are often structural. They're things that we can control. There are things that we can change there. I think there's more work to do, but that one probably surprised me the most.
Thank you very much for that. Any more questions, please? No? Well, please put your hands together to thank Dr. Kate. I think the message there, I think, is how complex recovery can be, and it's over a long time period as well. It's something for all of us to think about in the response as well. So, I think that it's now lunchtime. My stomach's telling me, so I must be. I'd ask you please to be back for 12:45 so I can resume normal time. Thank you very much.